So imagine hypothetically behind me, there's a beautiful picture of a road. And on that road, there are about 6 signposts saying where we're headed. For me, I never believe in teaching as though it's a bad mystery novel. So I want to tell you where we're going. So our first stop will be an overview of what we'll try to cover in our 6 weeks. The second stop is a little bit about who I am and why we're pursuing this. Then the third and fourth stops look at 2 key frameworks that we want to kind of investigate during our time together. Then the last one will be a painting, where we get a chance to practice this whole question of reception history and how it formulates ideas of race. So those will be our 6 little stops along the way. All right. Our first stop is just an overview. So we'll be together for 6 weeks, or 5 and 4/8, given the time. Our first stop today is just a generic overview of what we want to cover and defining a couple of key concepts. Next week, we'll look at Genesis chapter 1. How many of you have read Genesis 1 before? Okay. And since your pastor's here, even if you haven't, raise your hand. Right? So Genesis 1, famous creation story. And we'll look at how that was used to define American racial hierarchy. I'm sure you've read it, and every time you think, yes, clearly God is defining segregation, you laugh. But for 240 years in this country, that's exactly one of the dominant interpretations of that. So we will look at how that developed, and we'll read together a brief little excerpt from one of the famous writers in the late 1700s, early 1800s, who describes that. That'll be week 2. Week 3 and 4 will focus on Genesis chapter 4, or the so-called Mark of Cain. How many have heard of the Mark of Cain? Okay, good number. So the Mark of Cain tells the story, at least in this context, of how blackness and whiteness got created, and why whiteness attaches to ideas of innocence and of integrity, while blackness, in the work I'm doing, focuses on ideas of dangerousness, of depravity, of deviance. So we'll look at how the Mark of Cain gets used to construct blackness and whiteness there. Then, in our last 2 weeks, we'll look at Genesis chapter 9 and Genesis chapter 10. So Genesis 9 is the famous curse of Ham. Genesis 10, if you're a real Bible reader, you have skipped religiously, because it's a list of about 23 verses of names. As biblical scholars, we love those things, which is why we need your prayers, that we get excited by random things. But we'll look at, again, how those 2 passages in particular have been used to define racial categories. The one thing I'll say, just as a sort of a caveat, and my wife, who's with you, is a clinical psychologist, so she's not taking notes on all of you, do not be worried. But she's very good at helping me front some reality. So the reality I want to front for us is this is the worst class, because it violates everything my mother and father taught me. 3 things you never bring up in any conversation: religion, politics, race. What is this class about? Religion, politics, and race. So bring the discomfort, bring the anger, bring the sadness. That's part of how we learn. Now I mentioned earlier about with head, heart, and hand. Bring your head and heart here. Let it be here. Because that's what will make this not just an interesting fact, but hopefully transformative for us all. All right. I will pause there before we go to the next point. Questions, queries, comments, consternations? Excellent. Our next stop is how we got here. So imagine on the screen behind you a black and white photo taken around 1915 of my home church, Macedonian Baptist Church in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That home church was founded by my great-grandparents, the Givens family and the Eubanks family. I'll try to talk about them and not tear up, but it's hard for me to talk about my ancestors and not do so. They were the first in my family who were not owned by another human being. I am the fourth man in my family born that was not the property of another human being. The fourth. The children we are in the process of adopting will add the fifth. So literally, we could come in here and 3 of the 5 men in my family who've not been owned by another will be sitting in this classroom. That's why this work matters to me. Right? If we carry, from epigenetics, they'll tell us we carry our grandparents with us. My grandmother escaped Florida when her city was burned to the ground by white Klansmen and city folk. She escaped because her former slave owners of her mother had a loyalty to her and said, we can't stop them, but we can tell you to get out. She makes it. Her father doesn't. So she ends up losing contact and becomes into foster care. You may have heard of a famous city in Florida called Roswell. Hers was a less famous one a few miles away from that. As part of the story of that, when you listen to the interviews, they will quote the good book as justification for what they did. I say that just to frame why this matters for me, and I imagine for many of you. Right? This is not just an artifact of a long lost day, but it pervades very much how we think about ourselves, how we think about this nation, and how we often think about our faith. I'm an insider to the Christian faith and to this American nation. Every man in my family has served and bled in the armed forces. And because I love this country and I love this Christ, I want us to be better. And that's the goal of this class, to help us think about how we can be better by understanding where we have gone wrong before. Hopefully that will not get me banned, but hey, if it does, I'll join a good list. Third. All right. You're right, exactly. The third point was to think about 2 ways of understanding the Bible, or 2 methods. One method is this fancy word you learn in seminary called exegesis. How many have heard of the word exegesis? Okay, can someone shout out what you know about the term exegesis? Interpretation. Explore. Get one more shout out. Interpret, explore. Exactly, draw out from the text. Beautiful. I can tell you have theologians in your midst. So typically when we study the Bible, we do exegesis. We try to understand what did the text mean, or what were its range of meanings in its original contexts. For those of us who take the Bible to not just be an interesting historical artifact, but a testament to a living God, part of why we ask that ancient question is to figure out, how then shall we live? If God said something true 2,700 years ago, then how does it affect how I ought to live today? Right? Depending on your generation, the hashtag WWWJD, right? What would Jesus do? It's a version of why we do exegesis, to figure out what would Jesus do. So that's one method. The method that we will focus on in our time together is this idea called reception history. How many have heard of reception history before? Okay, just a couple. So reception history starts often with exegesis, but then it moves to asking two other questions. The first question it asks is, how does a text acquire meaning over time? So how does a text acquire meaning over time? This question of how a text acquires meaning over time is a way of saying we aren't just interested in what the text meant 2,000 years ago or 2,800 years ago. We're interested in how people have come to understand its meaning today. Imagine behind you on the screen, there's this little picture of a little box with an apple going into it. Then it comes through the machine and it comes out like an apple pie. So no, I'm not giving you a shameless plug to go run buy apple pie, although it is one of my favorites. Have a kindred apple pie lover there and a fellow lawyer, so we know that we were. But an apple is not an apple pie, much to the chagrin of anyone who has anyone at 5 years of age or younger in your life. And maybe for some of us who have never grown past 5 in our diets, where we want apples and apple pies to be synonymous. But there's a way we can get from apples to apple pie. Reception history is a way of tracing that journey. How do we get from apples to apple pie? First question. The second question is, why does it matter? What is the effect of this process of interpretation? Right? There's a lot of fun German words. I won't bore you with them now. But if you come to seminary, you'll learn a bunch of German words in classes. Well, one way that reception history is defined is the history of effects. Right? What are the consequences, the effects of this? For our purposes, what we want to look at is, what are the effects of the reception of these texts in creating blackness and whiteness in America? Again, so what are the effects of the interpretation of these texts in creating notions of whiteness and blackness in America? Right? And that's sort of the arc of the class that we want to investigate. Now, that was a lot, so let me pause for a moment. Thoughts, queries, clarifications? Yes?
So I'm originally from Venezuela, and I know the frame of this class is survival of race in America, but do you think America influences the rest of the world? All those things that he's talking about, thank you, the definition of whiteness and blackness with, innocence and goodness, and the aspiration applies as well to how I grew up in our Latin American culture. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that's important is to recognize that one of the realities is we could do this class from every nation and from multiple versions, right? I'm sorry? Multiple locations and multiple contexts. So we can look at it as black, white. We could also do it white, and we'll use this old Sunday school song, right? Jesus loves the little children of the world, red and yellow. They are. Jesus loves. I got a church here. So we can literally do it with any of those categories, red, yellow, black, white. For American context, and part of it is you are afflicted with my interest, is since I'm most interested in blackness and whiteness, that's kind of what we focus on. But you'll see it throughout the course, and as you said, you can find this vestige of these ideas just about anywhere you look. And so certainly how this will expand over time is to think about how that affects kind of larger other clusters. Cool. Any other? Questions, comments, queries? So these are all the slides just as you imagined them, right? Excellent. The last piece, yes, sir.
Please do not follow a rabbit trail. That's where this question leads. I think, a lot of us are aware that there's been kind of a twisted perception from Scripture of race and, as you say, associating darkness with evil, this kind of thing. And there's a book I've gotten and haven't read yet on how even the texts, the New Testament texts, and the canon were somewhat influenced by, certain cultural and racial biases and so forth.
Right.
But can you say anything more about something as broad as Paul or whoever it was that says, He has called you out of darkness into His marvelous light? Yeah. Just could you say briefly anything about how that relates? Do we need to get away from that passage? Just say something about how that relates to your comments, please.
Yeah, no, excellent. So two things. One is to recognize that the biblical writers had no concept of race as we understand it today. So, if this class was, does the Bible talk about race? It's a 10-second class. No. Thank you for coming. God bless you. Right? But how that gets used is a much longer conversation. So, and we'll talk a bit about this in more depth, but we can do the 30-second version now. It's biblical metaphors of light and darkness quickly become racialized in kind of the so-called Middle Ages, and certainly when we get to the founding of America. So metaphors of light and darkness, metaphors of good and evil, right? If good is typically light and darkness is typically evil, then it's a very quick move in Western European imagination, starting around the 15th century is when it really takes a foothold, to say goodness, lightness, whiteness, us. Darkness, evil, blackness, them. And once that gets set in, right, the train of horrors that many of us are aware of begins to roll. And one of the things that's useful in reception history to think about it is that racism predates the interpretations of these texts this way. So it's not as though they read the Bible and self-evidently said, yes, whites are better, blacks are worse, red are even worse than that. But what happens if you have that framework, which is kind of what the last point of biblical worldview is, then you find ways of making it work. So biblical worldview, and this is one of the kind of assumptions of the literature we'll read in our conversations, is that as a Christian who has a biblical worldview, I argue that the Bible tells me what the world is and what the world should be. Right? So again, a biblical worldview tells me this is what the world is and this is what it should be. So when I come into a context where I see one class of people that have power politically, have educational access, that's the world as it should be. So therefore, I go to the Bible to see, well, how does it tell me that? And so how do we move from darkness to light? Right? The British ancestors of this country will talk about Great Britain as being in darkness, not of blackness, but of bad politics, bad government. God gave us to the light of this new world. Well, all you have to do is get to about age 9 in Vacation Bible School to know this story. I'm in a place of oppression. I cross a big body of water to find a land. What does that sound like? Exactly. Exodus in the Red Sea. And so quickly, again, all you have to do is get to about 7 in Vacation Bible School. You cross that water, you come in this land. Then some of the ugly parts or the troubling parts come in. So you get to this land that's promised to you. But is it empty? No, it's not empty. So what do you have to do? Right, you have to find a way to kill him or get rid of him. Do we have a biblical precedent for that? Kinda. And so Ezra Stiles, and we may read a little bit of him, 1780, talks about, he takes that same story and says, and I deem the Indian or the Native American to be the modern day Canaanite. And so just as ancient Israel could exterminate the Canaanites to get the promised land, he will argue we have the same access to that land here. And so that's part of that process of how that develops. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Alan. You do that well. You should think about being a game show host. So even though the writers of the Bible did not understand the concept of race, are you saying that they did understand the concept of tribe and economic classes, so they understood the concept of the other?
Yes.
And that then devolved into interpretations about race?
Yes. So the Bible is very clear about, well, I'll say very clear now, we can nuance it, with several forests dying. The Bible is deeply tribal. That tribalism, as you described it, very easily maps onto a very racial and racialized world. And so part of the journey of reception history is, how does the Bible's tribalism translate into forms of race-based kind of arguments? So they are aware that we are not Babylonians. We are not Hittites. We are not Amorites. And so if that is true, which it is, then how do you define yourself? Are you the Israelite? Are you the Hittite? Are you the Amorite? Everyone wants to be Israel, right? Like if you're picking a team in the Bible, you want to pick Israel, right? If you take nothing else away from first class, pick Israel, right? And so then Israel's others, you then map it on to who are your others. And so then that tribally based or ethnic based distinctions becomes racialized. And that launches us into the last 500, 600 years of biblical reception. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions before we move forward? All right. So this is why I get banned. So how many of you have heard of the concept of white supremacy before? Right. So one of the things that I've talked about, my wife and I, in a piece that's coming out soon, we don't like to talk about white supremacy, but instead we talk about the lie of white supremacy. So LOWS. So you'll hear me throughout our 6 weeks together talk about the lie of white supremacy, or just lows. Part of why it's important for us to emphasize it as a lie is to make sure we don't spend too much time fighting against that which is not true. The more we say white supremacy, the more we make it sound like it's a real thing. But if you always begin with the lie of white supremacy, then we already know we've changed our conversation a bit. As a result of that, we no longer use the term racist. Instead, we ask, how much do you embody the lie of white supremacy? Going back to your point earlier, that imbibing of the lie of white supremacy is across the globe. Red and yellow, black and white, we all imbibe this lie. So the question then is, how do we identify when we've had that lie? Then how do we counter it? So part of your question, sir, I can't see your name from back here. Slide up. Sam, okay. That's okay. About what do we do with this? So part of, for me, and again, this is not a recommendation. this is just me. There's certain hymns I don't sing. Right? I'm an old school believer in atonement theology. And some of my brothers and sisters in systematics will be upset at me, but it's okay. The blood still has power. I'm not Baptist dude. But I also will never sing the song, "And he washed me white as snow." The emphasis is on snow, but in this country, it's become on white. So I don't sing that hymn anymore. Because I do not want to associate Christ's sacrifice and purity with the lie of white supremacy regarding whiteness. So that's something I do. I am not Jesus, obviously. You will never stand before my throne on Judgment Day. But it is a way that I try to think about, how do I embody this? What do my hands look like in the churches, in the sermons, so I don't quote those kinds of hymns, or at least not those portions of it. So, for our time together, what we want to look at is the association between ideas of whiteness, how that becomes equated to Christian, and how Christianness becomes associated with Americanness. Again, so how does whiteness become associated with what it means to be Christian? And how does being Christian get associated with what it means to be an American? Again, one need only pull up your phone right now or grab a newspaper or drive 10 minutes and you'll hear how this discourse is very much animating the world we see today. For our time together, we'll look at three concepts of whiteness, and I'll blow through these quickly just in realization of the hour. As a Baptist preacher, I like alliteration and assonance, so you'll get a lot of things in 3 I's, 3 D's, etc. That just helps my mind work. So the three primary myths that support the lie of white supremacy is the myth of innocence. The myth of innocence argues what I have done is not wrong because it can always be justified. Right? So again, the myth of innocence says what I have done is not wrong because it can always be justified. Integrity. Think of integrity as simply an idea of moral superiority. Think of integrity as the idea of moral superiority. Random example, because there are several lawyers in the room are recovering lawyers. One of the things I did in my previous legal practice is I occasionally did white collar crime. At the time, it didn't bother me, but now looking back on it, I'm like, why is it certain criminal offenses get the label white, which means they have less intense prison sentences? Right? If you lie, in violation, some would argue, of the 10 Commandments, if it's not too big of a lie, what do we call it? A white lie. So again, I'm not here to make a big deal, and every time you see the word white, it diminishes it. But, ... how is that being imbibed between notions of innocence and integrity? The final I that we'll talk about is this notion of industry. Industry, think of it as hard work. So part of what gets constructed about these biblical narratives is that whiteness means you work hard. And that feeds into the myth of meritocracy. I got what I got because I worked hard for it. If this weren't a good Presbyterian church, I might put an emphasis word in there. But you know, yes, ma'am.
Where on your list is willful?
Yeah. So the question for those online is, where does willful ignorance fit into that? For me, willful ignorance falls under the category of innocence because it's a choice to maintain certain views of myself. So I'll steal from my wife's work. There's this concept of ego protection. which says I keep at bay anything that threatens my view of self. So if I keep at bay or push away anything that threatens my view of self, that contributes to innocence, right? And we may have time to look at one quick slide as an example of that. But you have to do that if this live white supremacy is going to work.
Doesn't it also include the unwillingness to acknowledge integrity and honesty? I mean, is that giving
Yeah, I think so, but say a little bit more about that. Yes. Oh, sorry. Alan's bringing the mic over.
I didn't mean to
No.
take over. I feel like all of those things are so, people are so unwilling to accept that, first of all, integrity and industry and innocence are not a black and white issue, literally and figuratively.
Right.
And that, that what you said about, what I worked hard for what I have, that is a classic language of my story. I mean, my life.
Yeah.
And it's been 70 years. So I'm just admitting, everybody's surprised. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say, is that I feel like there's that all that together is part of, and then it goes back to then using scripture to justify.
Right.
So
Exactly. Yeah. And so
I just love that what you did.
thank you. Yeah. So what you do is you create a feedback loop, right? If we are accurate, that part of what it means to be American means what it means to be Christian. And part of what it means to be Christian means you're based on the Bible, right? And we may not have time to read it during our time together, but I'll put it on the website. An argument that gets made as early as the late 17th century is that America's laws are God's laws. So when you oppose the laws of America, what are you really opposing? God. And so it's no longer a political discourse of, I agree with this form of housing. It's now, are you standing with God or are you standing against God? And so part of the brilliance, and you'll hear me use this phrase, wicked genius. The wicked genius of this system is that I have aligned myself so much with God and God so much with me, I don't ever have to question myself, because if I do, I'm actually questioning God. And that live white supremacy gets imbibed by a lot of folks. There's an African-American brother, Vodi Bakum. If you listen to some of his recent interviews, right, sorry to say straight out of Compton, but which is where he grew up, actually. But ironically, I can take what he said and drop it in 1852, and you would hear no difference between what he said and what they said. And it's part of how these myths keep being perpetuated. Absolutely. Any other questions on that? So we have 10 minutes. So Vodi, V-O-D-D-I-E, Bakum, B-A-U-C-H-M-A-N-N. So he's an African-American brother out of Compton, California, who's one of sort of the famous spokespersons for the Reformed tradition.
Where'd you get that picture?
Interestingly, you can buy this on a t-shirt for $20. If we had more time, I would love to get conversation about it, but in respect to the time, this is where the live white supremacy leads us, or one of the places it leads us. Where, going back a bit to your question, tell me your name, man. I'm trying to see your name. Lasley, okay. Going back to your question, Lasley, part of how this gets imbibed is not only is Jesus racialized white, He is literally draped in the American flag. Exegesis tells you that ain't true. You know, I know you're like, wow, we came to learn that fact. Thanks, Dr. Kemp. Yes, Jesus was not wearing an American flag around first century. What is he holding in his hands? Right. Is that historically accurate? Right. Be very different gospels if Jesus was walking around with AK-47s. What's behind him? Right. So part of what this image does is it connotes this idea that American violence is divinely justified. That's Ezra Stiles from 1780. As well as you can buy this now on Amazon. This is not a shameless plug to buy the shirt, but it's just to let you know you can buy it right now. And so part of what we want to do is look at how we get here. And the journey, again, there's a wicked genius to this journey. And so as you were describing earlier about hearing certain arguments in your life, that's also true for generations before you. And so the question is, how do we intervene so that this does not continue? Well, at least that's my interest. Second thing. How many have seen this image before? Okay. This is the other side of that live white supremacy. This is a famous portrait of an enslaved African male who has been obviously whipped and tortured. Next to him on the screen is a quotation, I'll read it. "You must not think from what I say that I'm opposed to slavery. No, the Negro is damned and is to serve his master till God chooses to remove the curse of Ham." This is part of a series of speeches and sermons given by Brigham Young around Mormonism in the middle part of the 19th century. One of the ideas of the myth of innocence and how this plays out here is if this individual is actually creating the image and likeness of God, entitled to dignity and honor, and you do this to him, who is the monster in this story? Who is the monster? One way around that is what I call blackness in 3D. The argument becomes, through scripture, we can demonstrate through the curse of Ham, which will be our last 2 weeks, and the mark of Cain, which we'll look at starting in 2 weeks. The argument becomes that God has branded all black people with these three attributes: that we are fundamentally dangerous, we are fundamentally deviant, and we are irredeemably depraved. So because we are dangerous, depraved, deviant, at least according to the live white supremacy, this is what we deserve, because it's the only way, as Brigham Young will say later, to curb the savage impulses of the heathen, to bring them into the light of the gospel. Brigham Young is not unique in that attitude. Yes, sir.
I have liked to think that we Reformed people were often somewhat above this fray or more exemplary. And in my limited experience of reading history on this, some of our Puritan Reformed forebears had some of the most horrific language to justify anything they did to the Native Americans,
Yes.
and then later as slaves. So it's everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. That's part of the one of the images we use in our work is the live white supremacy is like a gravitational force. Everyone is affected by it. It pulls everyone in. and the amount of work it takes to not be affected by it or to fight against the effect of it is exhausting. And often it's easier to just say, hey, if everybody's flowing, I'll just flow with it. And so that becomes part of the challenge. How do we fight against it? In a lot of different ways. And part of what I hope to do in our time together is just lay out what is the it we are fighting against and how deep it goes. In our last 5 minutes. So in time, we would have read Genesis 2:21 through Genesis 3, verse 7. The Cliff Notes or the Kemp Notes version of it, God puts the man to sleep, takes out a rib. We can argue about what that is later. And out of that rib, he forms the first woman who becomes known as Eve. They're chilling in the Garden of Eden. And then this happens, the fall, as it's called in Christian tradition. 2 questions. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit. Number 1. What is the race of the individuals in this painting? Right. Right. You say Italian, right? Yeah, so this is by an Italian artist. Right. Does the Bible ever tell us the race of Adam and Eve or the skin color of Adam and Eve? No. What fruit typically is Eve said to have eaten? Apple. Does the Bible tell us it's an apple? No. So this is one of those interesting moments of reception history. How do we get to an apple? Well, there's a long journey for that. But what's most relevant for our class and our time is the racialization of Adam and Eve. If the first people God created were white, what does that say about the place of whites in God's worldview? Right, they're at the top. Before Adam and Eve ate of the apple, what was their moral character like? Pure. What's an I word for pure? Innocence. So one of the foundational things that we'll be able to unpack a bit more next week is if the first humans were white and by association innocent, then how do we get to blackness? Right? Because there's no way, if Adam and Eve were my mom and dad, right, this is not the family picture. Right? That's not how it's going to happen. Again, I'm not a PhD in biology or geneticist, but I think I got that right. If there's those of you in the room who are, please correct me if I'm wrong. But that ain't going to happen. So therefore, if whiteness is the natural state of things, blackness must be aberrant. The D word for aberrant, deviant. And so that begins the process of how we get from there to where we are. Think we have just time? Okay. So 5 seconds. Thank you for your time. The reason we end with the picture of Jesus is most people don't care about Adam and Eve. But if Jesus is a black man and not a white man, that messes up a whole lot of things in the Christian world. So thank you for your time very much.